You ever think about how hard it is to walk?
I mean, there have been times in my life where it's been hard to walk,
It's a complex process.
but as a norm, it feels rather easy, even though there's so many aspects of our physicality that go into it that it's a lot more of a complex series of movements than a lot of people think or know about.
Yeah. And yet it becomes second nature. It's interesting because on a neurological level, the more consistently we do something, the more the brain will build little internal machines to manage the mental resources that normally take a lot of brain power, like keeping your focus on something that you haven't figured out very well. When you're in the process of learning things and you're just trying to absorb what's going on and how things are supposed to be done, remembering the steps, all that, the same, your brain has to do the same amount of work in terms of managing that information. But it kind of goes from the frontal lobe part of your brain, which is more concerned with active choice making that isn't habituated. Basically, another way to say that is the frontal lobe is what allows you to make choices that you wouldn't necessarily normally make. To make new choices that go against your habits or your routine, or maybe even ones that are uncomfortable. But then the more habituated ones, after you've put a lot of effort into the frontal lobe trying to take care of things, then it gets sent on back to other parts of the brain where your brain is more accustomed a little bit to the details and the processes, figuring out how to manage all the little pieces, and then it optimizes those, and then these little extra machines that it builds in your neural circuitry can go to work without you having to focus on them, and they'll just kind of handle the details, kind of like muscle memory, I guess, something along those lines. And so what was hard doesn't become less complicated, but it does become less tiresome to manage mentally. And yeah, then you get it down, you get it habituated, and even if it still takes some work, it's as easy as walking, or maybe as easy as driving, which hopefully is easy for anyone who gets any place. Anyone watching.
I like that point, that it's not that the task itself actually becomes easier or less complicated. Just our mind becomes, after consistently doing it and over, and all of that work and energy and consistency put towards it, your brain just becomes more accustomed to doing it. So it seems easier or second nature, but the task still remains the same. It's your brain and yourself that has grown, and your potential has increased to the point where it feels mundane, even though at one point not necessarily mundane, but it feels simple, even though at one point it was complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's amazing how much our brains can keep track of, because not that it's meaningful to try and put a number on one's mental capacities, but if we take a look at our conscious mind, our actual conscious mind versus our subconscious, the subconscious mind is something on the order of 90 to 95% of what's going on in our heads. And I mean, even when we are fully awake, even when we are engaged and focused on a task or a problem, it's not to say that our brain isn't working hard. But the conscious part, the actual conscious part, that's the frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex. That is responsible for a lot less of what we actually do than most people would believe. The part that takes effort to carefully figure out, like things that are outside of your comfort zone, things that you haven't trained or prepared for, things that are just being thrown at you and you're trying to figure out how to deal on the fly with a new opportunity or a new problem or a new disaster, whether it's running into a group of people that might possibly turn out to be good friends on a vacation that you're taking, or having a getting sideswiped on the freeway, and all of a sudden you ain't going nowhere, and trying to figure out how to deal with the situation, how to resolve it. That's the conscious portion. Because the stuff that we already know how to do well is the stuff that's habituated, the stuff that has the little neural machines that are at work, at least most of the time, farther back in our brains. Yeah, the conscious portion is actually pretty tiny.
And the thing about that unconscious part of our brain is we can literally, to a certain degree, not completely alter it, but we can program certain aspects of it through consistent activity patterns. And we can start to, like, for example, sleep patterns. That can be something that's very difficult for someone to change. But through the correct steps and processes, I know this from personal experience, having worked night shifts for almost a decade and a half of my working career, and then switching over to having to work mornings after that, and then it was very difficult for me to change my sleep pattern at first. But through consistent effort, you can change that part of your brain and adjust certain behaviors to where you can change the way your brain processes through certain things to allow for new habits and new thought processes.
Yeah.
And like, if you're constantly inundating yourself with negative things like sad, depressing music, or you're constantly around people who are kind of Debbie Downers and they only talk about what's bad with the world, or people who are angry about the way the world has gone, you can start to adopt those behaviors on a subconscious level because your subconscious is being exposed to it so much that it starts to adapt and take on those patterns, as it were. That's why we tend to mirror certain aspects of our friend groups and our inner circle, as some people call it. But if you listen to positive, upbeat music, occasionally if you're around positive people who build you and each other up, if you listen to motivational content, that tends to take your brain in the other way, where you tend to become a more uplifting and positive individual instead of the alternative.
Right.
So it's just interesting that you can literally reprogram your brain to a certain extent on that subconscious level simply by the things you expose yourself to and allow into your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's the scarier part, though. Basically everything that constitutes your subconscious mind required conscious effort at one point or another. It's layers upon layers of what your conscious mind at one point was having to deal with, and then was reinforced and habituated, and is now subconscious. Everything from not biting your tongue to using a fork properly. I guess those two can go together sometimes. To being able to read and write music, driving a car, as we mentioned earlier, other stuff like that. Whatever it is that you have habituated, you had to consciously learn at one point. Now, sometimes it means that you were like 3 months old when you picked the skill up, Um, and yeah, it's really interesting how stuff that we pick up early on in our childhoods kind of gets embedded so far down underneath the strata of everything else. But pretty much everything that makes up the entire internal processes of your mind, in terms of the tasks that your brain is doing for you, those were conscious at one point, and then they became reinforced and habituated. Now you have those little neural machines handling the details in the background. And if you have neural machines that make sure that you always have a sense of being pathetic and worthless, and being reminded that your efforts are so far short of what they should be, or what some other person's achievement is, then that could be a problem. And so it's really a two-edged sword, because there are very few mental and emotional issues that just suddenly are there overnight. Almost all of them are habituated. And the hard thing about that is that sometimes the habituation of the negativity or the limiting belief or whatever, we don't know any better. We don't have better tools at certain points in our life that would allow us to get around that habituation of the negativity and things that hold us back. Sometimes we legitimately don't have better tools at our disposal, but sometimes we do. And thank God for the ability that you mentioned of being able to go in and through conscious practice and changing your environment and the things that you expose yourself to, you can gradually change some of those elements so that they can start to work for you instead of against you.